Hi, Sophie.
Hi, Sin.
Hi, everyone, and welcome to Gaming in the Yeltsin Years.
Episode 8.
Episode 8.
I remembered this time.
I'm so proud of you.
Thank you.
And today we are talking about a Yeltsin Years event. Well, pre-Yeltsin Years event.
Well, yeah, I mean, I don't think Yeltsin wasn't involved in, Laika.
No, the point is, this game
Or Mars
is
colonization.
based on... The point
Is President too late to do anything about the space race, but too early to colonize Mars?
The point is, this game is based on true real facts, Sophie.
Yeah, sure.
Today we're talking about Planet Laika. Or as it's written,
Yeah, I
they
noticed
use
that.
the D's, instead.
The Russian Cyrillic alphabet is just the Roman alphabet, but the R is backwards.
Yeah.
Yeah. Planet Laika is a Japan-only PlayStation 1 game that was released in 1999. It received a fan translation into English a couple of years ago. And it's a game that it hasn't gotten a ton of attention either from the English-speaking world or really in Japan at the time. Like, I was searching the internet for Japanese articles on Planet Laika, and there kind of barely are any.
Mm-hmm.
It doesn't seem to have really made much of an impact, and a lot of the articles that were very, very positive about it, they usually included something along the lines of like, yeah, and this game's really, really easy to find on eBay for like 100 yen.
Yeah, that's surprising to me, Sophie, because if I had to put it into a category, I'd be like, this is clearly a game made by David Lynch. And he was pretty popular at the time.
The thing that interests me about this game not being that popular is it's by the same people that worked on another adventure game called Kowloon's Gate that has a very similar kind of graphical style to it. It's also a very abstract sort of psychological adventure game. And that has a lot of people very, very interested in it, even though that never got an English translation. There's not even a fan one of it, but you will occasionally see just like mainstream English-speaking video game sites talk about Kowloon's Gate.
Mm-hmm.
That's resonated with people, possibly because it's based on an actual place, whereas Planet Laika, it's like almost impossible to find anything. There was one long play of Planet Laika I found on YouTube, and that was it.
Mm-hmm.
You played how much of Planet Laika?
A couple of hours.
Couple of hours, yeah. I did play it all the way through to the end. I'd say it's about 9 or 10 hours long. What I found was interesting about it lengthwise is that, like, it's an adventure game. And usually these sorts of adventure games, if you know what you're doing and you make the right decisions, they're over very, very quickly.
Mm-hmm.
Planet Laika railroads you a lot. Like, with a few exceptions, there's really only one decision you can make. But the game still manages to be quite lengthy. It's like, I imagine like a fast run through would be more like maybe 7 hours as opposed to 10. So still quite lengthy. Yeah. What did you experience in those 2 hours of Planet Laika?
A lot of confusion, to be honest. I also found it a little bit, at least the first hour, a little bit tedious because you had to read a lot.
Yeah.
Like, there were those scenes with the words at the bottom of the screen and you had to press X multiple times as you told the game you pretended to read it because you wanted to get to the action.
Yeah, the action.
Like, what I learned is that I'm on Mars, something's happening with people's faces, but I'm also a dog. I'm Laika, but also I have, like, split personality that manifests physically, that helps me get through the city to get somewhere, but also I have a lot of childhood issues I need to work through.
So you mentioned you were waiting for the action to start. What sort of action did you find in Planet Laika? Like, did you do any combat?
Yes, there was one combat that I did do. That was also very confusing. I don't even know how to describe it, Sophie. There was, I think, an orb challenged me, and it was shooting lasers at me. But
Mhm,
then I had a ball that could
mhm,
deflect the lasers, but I couldn't really control the ball. I just pressed all buttons and I won.
mhm.
And I was like, good for me.
So, Planet Laika is described on most websites that host information relating to it as an RPG.
Hmm.
It really isn't. I can understand why it's being categorized like that because the
Hmm.
gameplay design is around like you are exploring things on a world map, and then
Hmm.
you will sometimes encounter an enemy, and when that happens, you go into like a sort of abstract combat screen where you fight them.
Hmm.
It's kind of like an RPG in that way, except it doesn't really have stats. There's no equipment
Okay.
in it. There's no experience points. You sort of level up in that when you defeat boss monsters, your maximum number of hit points will go up.
Okay.
But that's all. So every enemy encounter that's not a boss nets you absolutely nothing.
Yeah.
Pretty much the only way that you make progress in Planet Laika is you just find the right NPC to talk to, and then the next thing will happen. But
Hmm.
it is presented aesthetically almost like it is a survival horror game, where you have these quite detailed for the PlayStation 1 models running around on pre rendered backdrops.
Hmm.
And it also has this sort of survival horror vibe to it, where everything is slightly off. The atmosphere is very sort of oppressive. There's a lot of paranoia in the characters. The game is very explicitly about how these characters interact with like what they believe to be evil and how their own
Yeah.
trauma is shaping their interactions with this evil that is kind of reified as a substance.
Hmm.
And yeah, you mentioned the combat system's very abstract. The combat system is basically Pong.
Okay, now it makes sense.
Yeah, or Arkanoid or something. Like, I've never
Yeah.
seen anything like this, but it feels like this is something that would come out now. Like, someone would make an indie game about people dealing with their trauma through this, like, abstract sort of Pong Arkanoid game where what
Hmm.
happens is your character is on the left side of the screen and your opponent's on the right side of the screen, and your opponent will spit these sort of glowing orb things at you. And
Hmm.
you control, sort of, a single glowing orb.
Hmm.
And what happens is if your orb touches your opponent's orb, it will knock it back into them like you're playing Pong with them. But the thing about the orb that you're controlling is that it is locked to this sine wave pattern. It just sort of goes up and down and up and down and up and down regardless of your input. And what your input's actually doing is you're just controlling its horizontal momentum. You can
Oh,
make the orb go forwards by
okay.
holding a button, but it will stick to that sine wave pattern. So you can't actually control how high or how low it is. You have to kind
Okay.
of visualize that in your head. Like, okay, if I'm at this height now and I push forward, I'll be at this height when I'm at this position on the screen, sort of deal.
Hmm.
I think it's supposed to look like a heart monitor.
Oh, okay.
It sounds more confusing than it is. It took me a few attempts to kind of get what it was doing, but when I got the hang of the combat, I actually quite enjoyed it. It feels like some weird like 1970s arcade game. So you mentioned that like your understanding of the premise of the story was like you're on Mars and there's faces and you're a dog. You had some trauma. How would you explain the story that you played in the first 2 hours?
Well, I think I'm Laika, the famous space dog, or something
Mm-hmm.
like that. I have a lot of like childhood issues. I have some trauma from the fact that I think my mother remarried a man who already had a child or children, and there's some like jealousy and conflict going on there where like I'm having a hard time accepting my like new stepfather. They're having a hard time accepting me. There's like perhaps violence in the home. And yeah, It's interesting how those sort of moments come in as memories where it kind of goes in and out as you play the game. So you don't know, you can just enter a room
Yeah.
and then everything changes, everything is weird, and you get like a flashback to your childhood. I thought that was pretty effective.
Yeah, so you mentioned that like there's a lot of traumatic stuff in the game.
Hmm.
The game is actually like I found it quite hard to play through in parts.
Hmm.
Recommending someone play Planet Laika is sort of like recommending someone watch Requiem for a Dream.
Hmm.
It's very, very heavy, and it's heavier than you would initially think, even based on the first 2 hours, where it's like the dog has childhood trauma about his abusive stepfather. Like, it goes into places that, like, if you didn't know it was coming and you were sensitive to it, it might actually, like, really, really, really mess with you.
It's true, yeah.
No, but the thing is, you're saying it's true based on the first 2 hours.
Yeah.
Um, the first 2 hours is like the happy part.
Oh no!
It's the sort of stuff you would expect in like Silent Hill. So the
Yeah.
premise of Planet Laika, in as much as I understand it having played it once, is that this is set at this unspecified point, but in the very distant future, after humanity has reached Mars. When they reach Mars, they encounter Martians, as in actual aliens that live on Mars. And the
Hmm.
Martians are a hive mind, and they don't have any individuality.
Hmm.
The exact nature of humanity's relationship with the Martians at that point is, I don't think, ever really explained. It's left deliberately vague, but
Okay.
humanity makes a pact or a treaty with the Martians, which is called the Contract of Faces.
Hmm.
And humans willingly give up their faces, like as a species, and give their faces to the Martians.
Hmm.
But when the Martians get the human faces, the fact that all the humans look and act different to one another destroys their hive mind,
Aw.
and Martian civilization collapses and all of the Martians die. And because humans no longer have human faces, they are all dogs now.
Oh! But also, I'm pretty sure Laika has a tail.
Yes, that's true. They all have tails. So basically, humans willingly become dogs and give their faces to Martians who then die.
Oof.
Yeah, it's never really explained why. The closest I can kind of figure out from having played this extremely confusing game once is that like
Hmm.
when the humans gave up their like identity as humans, it sort of led to world peace. Like humans weren't fighting anymore because
Oh.
they weren't humans, they were dogs. So it's
Okay.
sort of it's like initially sort of presented as like, oh, humanity has been cursed and lost something and the Martians took it. But it's more like humanity sort of took like the negative aspects of being human and displaced it onto Mars so they wouldn't have
Okay.
to deal with it anymore. This is partially tied to a real life thing called the Face on Mars.
Is there an outline on a face
Yeah,
on
yeah,
Mars?
it was a big deal like in the like up until I think the 90s that like there was this famous photograph of the Cydonia region of Mars and you can see what looks like a human face on it.
It like rings a very abstract bell. Yeah.
Yeah, a lot of the game actually does take place in and around that face. So in Planet Laika, that is something that the Martians made to sort of commemorate the fact that they had humanity's faces. So after humanity give up their faces to the Martians and become dogs, and the Martians die,
Yeah.
humanity decide now is the time to like actually terraform and colonize Mars, given that the Martians are all gone.
Okay.
The first kind of wave of people they send there are prisoners. So they established this like prison colony on Mars, but there's also like there's researchers and there's some like shaman people as well that go there, and over time it becomes this sort of small self-governing, self-sustaining colony that is built inside what used to be a prison. The people who are on Mars, this first sort of wave of colonists, they discover that the minds of the dead Martians are still there.
Oh.
And what's happened is they have seeped into the surface of the planet and actually become this physical substance that they call evil mind.
Okay.
The evil mind is permeating the entire planet. So, like, wherever you are on Mars, you're sort of in contact with the evil mind. It's very, very similar to Solaris.
Mm.
Do you want to tell us about Solaris as the resident Slav?
It's very long and kind of boring for a sci-fi thing, to be honest.
Mm-hmm.
But it's like a planet, and it's all like fluid or gas or something. I don't remember. And then it talks to you, but it doesn't really understand you. So it just does weird things.
Yeah, Solaris is was a novel that was adapted into a, like you said, very long film by Andrei Tarkovsky, and it was then adapted again into like a shorter one with George Clooney. But
Yeah.
it's also kind of riffed on by Event Horizon.
What if Solaris was good and exciting? That's what Event Horizon is.
So the premise of Solaris is that there is this planet that is, from space, appears to be just one huge ocean.
Mm-hmm.
These people go to study Solaris, but then they discover that actually the Solaris ocean is one single organism. It's like this massive psychic entity. And the longer they spend around Solaris, it is trying to communicate with them. But like you said, because it's this alien entity, it doesn't understand humans. So it just starts like summoning up like horrible traumatic memories of like death and like things, and making them kind of live through it in these weird hallucinations.
Yeah, it's like I brought your dead wife back to life so you can fight with her again. What more do you want?
Yes, yeah. So Planet Laika, I'm fairly sure it's inspired pretty heavily by Solaris, given the like Soviet aesthetic it's going for. Although interestingly, in the Planet Laika guidebook, there's an interview with the people that made it, and they say that their two touchstones were Forbidden Planet and 2001: A Space Odyssey. I don't think they mentioned Solaris at any point, which is really strange.
And they didn't mention David Lynch?
No.
I feel like what really happened is it was Solaris and David Lynch, and they're like, okay, we can't say that because it's too obvious. Let's say something else.
So the evil mind is also causing hallucinations. Like in Solaris, people are seeing, like, they're reliving events, they're seeing people who aren't there, stuff like that. And people are starting to lose touch with whether they are dreaming or not. So this is all happening to humanoid dogs, by the way.
By the way.
So a research team are sent to investigate the evil mind and try to figure out, like, where it came from and how did they get rid of it. So the leader of the team, whose name is Galil, he just leaves a message announcing that God is dead and I am the light, and then he disappears. So your team are the ones who were sent in afterward to try to figure out what happened to Galil, and also try to figure out the evil mind thing. So it's like a bit Solaris. It's also a bit like Heart of Darkness, like tracking down this guy who's gone rogue and figure out what exactly happened to him. The player character is called Laika. That's not actually his name. You get to name the character at the start, and it does... Do you want to say what it does?
And then it adds, like, Nov at the end of your name to make you more Slav. That was beautiful.
Yeah, it asks you to input a name, and then when you do it, it just immediately adds Nov to the end.
Sophie Nov.
yeah. If I put Sophie in, it would have been Sophie Nov. So that's your real name, but most people will address you as Laika. You'll see your like real name show up during the traumatic flashbacks, like when you're remembering your parents talking to you, things like that.
Mm-hmm.
But the other people on the mission will only ever know you as Laika. Laika is
Mm-hmm.
supposed to be the radio operator. There's also like a captain, a pilot, and a geologist. The four of you have gone there. You're all dogs, and I feel like I need to keep bringing this up. So the thing about Laika is that Laika is kind of hyper empathic. The way that this
Mm-hmm.
sort of articulates from a gameplay point of view is that Laika's got three personas.
Mm-hmm.
How many of the personas did you get to play as?
I got to play as a big guy briefly, and then
Yeah,
somebody with blue hair, I think, but
yeah.
very like briefly.
So Laika's got these three personas that you can shift
Mm-hmm.
into, right? Like you said, there's a
Mm-hmm.
big guy called Ernest. There is a kind of vain lady called Yolanda. And then there's the blue guy you mentioned called Spacer, who is this like hyper intelligent psychic. And he looks really, really similar to the unused Sonic the Movie design. So each one of those three characters is associated with a different kind of what the game calls evil, which is also associated with a different color. There's these three different colors of evil, right? Which each correspond to a different negative emotion. The red evil energy is associated with Ernest, and it's meant to represent like anger or power or like trying to like force something to be a certain way, like you're lashing out.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
So that manifests as Ernest, who is this like big guy. His thing is he can get certain items other characters can't get by just punching walls and making them fall out.
Mm-hmm.
But it's mostly about like him just being a sort of forceful character. It's also important to mention that like the character's stats don't change. It's not like if you're in combat as Ernest, you're doing more damage. You're not. They all play exactly the same. They actually call this out in the guidebook because they say we didn't want the three characters to actually just be defined in terms of like game abilities. They wanted them to feel like three different people and three different perspectives on the world. So like there's a lot of optional stuff you can do in this when you're shifted into another character that doesn't actually change the story at all or really get you anything. They'll just talk
Mm-hmm.
differently, or they'll see different things, they'll remark on different things. So then there's this yellow evil energy that is associated with the game's calling it like vanity.
Mm-hmm.
It calls it vanity, it also calls it greed. It is associated with this lady called Yolanda,
Mm-hmm.
who is depicted as very superficial. That is supposed to represent like being selfish as a coping strategy.
Okay.
One of the things that like they do with this colony setup is that everyone on there is trying to sort of escape from the situation in different ways.
Mm-hmm.
And one of the ways they do that is there is just a plastic surgeon people go to change the
Okay.
way that they look. And there's like one specific character who is going there to try and get their face changed to look human rather than like a dog.
Okay.
So like in a sense it's a vanity, but it's also coming at it from the perspective of like this is an escape. Then there is the blue energy, which is associated with Spacer, who is the guy who looks like Sonic. And that is called knowledge or psycho. And the idea is it
Okay.
represents you becoming like a wiser person and learning. But at the same time, because you realize you know more than other people, you start pushing them around. Every single character in this game that you can interact with, and there's, I think, 35 of them, they are all associated with one of those three colors. And Laika is also like hyper empathic. So what ends up happening is you're Laika. You talk to someone who's got like a red angry aura.
Mm-hmm.
Every time you talk to them, it raises the red meter a little bit. When the
Yeah.
red meter gets high enough, there's this little portrait in the corner of Laika's face that will change to a portrait of Ernest.
Mm-hmm.
You then go to a mirror and you look in the mirror, and Laika's reflection will change into Ernest, and then you'll be playing as Ernest from that point onward.
Mm-hmm.
Same thing works for the others. So, talk to enough blue aura people, you can become Spacer. Talk to enough yellow aura people, you become Yolanda.
And then you can reset if you talk to like a dark cloud.
Or you can go back to the mirror again. The game feels like 400 different gameplay systems that are used once and then never mentioned again. So, like, they will keep saying, like, you go to a mirror, use a mirror. I think there's 2 mirrors in the whole game that you actually use.
Okay.
But there's more than that just in the game world. Like, 90% of the changes you undergo, they will be the same mirror, which is just randomly on a wall slightly outside of the colony. Mm-hmm. But then, like I mentioned, there's this whole vanity area of the colony where people are having plastic surgery done. There's a big mirror on the wall. It never does anything. There is an area with a reflective ice wall that you can see your reflection in. That mirror, I think, works once as part of a story event, and then it never works again.
That's strange.
Yeah, the place where you sleep, which is a whole kettle of fish in itself, like what the sleeping actually is doing, that's got a mirror on the wall, but again, it worked once for me and it never worked any other time.
Wait, but you just talked about sleep. What?
Yeah.
What about it? Yeah.
So you have a room in this game. You can only sleep in there when this little red light next to the bed is blinking. Mm-hmm. And it's very, very strange because it can sometimes be the solution to moving the plot forward, but I don't know why.
Okay.
Like we were saying, the structure of this is just talk to every NPC until something happens. Asterisk, sometimes this involves going to sleep. Like, you'll go to sleep and you'll have a dream that will then progress the plot. There was an absolutely, like, baffling moment where the solution was to go to sleep, wake up, and then I just went back to sleep again and something else happened, and that's how the plot moved forward. The thing about it that, like, I became very frustrated with was actually just the navigation. Because, like I said, it uses pre-rendered backdrops with polygon characters on it, right? Which is pretty standard for, like, PS1 games. But the game is set in, like, a series of fairly, like, big open spaces, like deserts and, like little colony cities and things like that. If you think about the way that, like, the PlayStation 1 Final Fantasy games did that, it's like, if you're in a space like that, the camera's really far back because it's this big space you need to be able to take in, like, how everything's laid out to be able to navigate it properly. Whereas something like Resident Evil, that's just set in a series of hallways and rooms. So the camera's pushed in much further because you don't actually need to have, like, that big sense of, like, the area that you're in. Planet Laika is like Final Fantasy, set in these big open spaces, but it uses the Resident Evil style camera is really close to the ground angles, and it is a fucking nightmare to navigate because you will be in just, like, a street and it won't be clear, like, what parts of this street connect to the rest of the space that you're in. Like, there's no sort of, like, real landmarks. Like, you'll leave a screen and you'll see in the distance, like, a doorway with a circle on it, and you'll walk toward it and just find yourself on a background that doesn't have that doorway on it. Like, I actually found just the act of running around this town trying to find the right NPC to talk to, like, it was really exhausting. But the really big problem there is that the NPCs will move around, and sometimes they'll just straight up disappear and reappear without any explanation. There was this specific character who was talking to me through a window, and he told me to go and talk to someone else. So I went, I talked to that other person, and I come back, and he's not at the window anymore. And that just leads to, like, literally probably, like, 10 straight minutes of, I just have to check every single building in this incredibly confusing to navigate space that has these very visible load times between like every single screen change. And just the sheer amount of just like, I have to check every single room because someone's not there. There were so many moments in it where like it's extremely vague and extremely unclear like what is actually going on a lot of the time. The thing is, like, I did really like this in spite of everything I'm saying, but like the fact that things like that are happening constantly, like it was really, really testing my patience in a bad way. Do you have anything you want to say?
Well, the 2 hours were testing my patience, and I only played it for 2 hours. It's a lot of reading, clicking, kind of walking back and forth, nothing happening. I feel like this should be maybe like a 4 hour game.
Well, see, the thing is, like, it could have been a 4 hour game if you just focused on one aspect of the plot.
Okay.
It's the thing about the story of Planet Laika is like I don't think it's nonsense. Like I think they
Mhm.
have there is like a coherent story to this kind of, but the way it is told is all over the place, and it feels like this was written to be a like 60-hour JRPG, and
Okay.
it somehow ended up compressed into 10 hours. So like, you know how I mentioned Galil, right, the captain?
Yeah.
The first thing that happens in the game is that they basically tell you that this previous expedition was led by a guy who proclaimed that God is dead and I am the light, and then he disappeared.
Yeah.
Um, they introduce so many other characters and so many plot threads and so many concepts in the first hour of the game that when they brought Galil up later on, I had forgotten he existed. I feel like if something like that is slipping your mind,
Yeah.
there's probably too many plates being
Too
spun.
much too much going on. Yeah.
The same thing happened with, remember I was talking about that like ice area. There is
Mhm.
a frozen underground cavern, and in it there is just this massive like frozen sort of like weird corpse golem that people talk about as like this is like the god of death who's coming for us. I forgot he existed until he showed up again like 3 hours later. Like it's this constant introduction of like character after character after character after character and concept after concept after concept after concept, and it's really overwhelming. And like I started keeping notes, and
Okay.
then I realized that I was missing out on stuff because I would look away from the screen to write something down, look back, and I'd missed the last two things that someone had said. So
God.
if you do plan on playing this, you absolutely need to get the guide that is on archive.org, because that actually
Mhm.
has a list of what character is what and like who is related to who, because it is a story where like there's this massive density of information, but it's probably only going to get told to you once.
Mhm.
So like every single thing I read about Planet Laika and watched about Planet Laika focused on the story was nonsense and no one could really follow it. And I
Mhm.
think like, yeah, this is legitimately a very, very hard story to follow. I think
Mhm.
if you played it once, made notes, and then played through it again, knowing what you know by the end of the first playthrough, it would probably coalesce into something more coherent. But like the first playthrough is just like,
Yeah.
I mean, everyone who's like, "Oh, Elden Ring is so confusing," play fucking 2 hours of Planet Laika and get back to me about like how your concept of confusing has shifted in that time, because like I mentioned like there's about 35 characters in Planet Laika. That's a lot of characters for a 10-hour game.
Yeah.
And like I don't mean like the innkeeper has a name or something like that, or like there's an NPC who does one thing. All of those characters are going to factor into like at least one or two of the puzzles in the game. and you
Hmm.
have to kind of keep track of all of them. But like that's really not possible without a guide. Like it is so confusing. Like I was at the end of the game and I still didn't know who people were. Like there was I know that there is a character called Smokey and people kept talking about Smokey and I remember that I once met someone called Smokey, but I can't remember what he looked like or what he was doing or where he was, and it ultimately didn't matter because I was able to beat the game anyway. It is the density of the information and the way it is delivered rather than the information itself. Like this,
Hmm.
I don't want to say like this game needed an editor because I think they knew it needed an editor, but it just comes across as like they just came up with way more stuff than could reasonably fit in 10 hours, but they decided to include it all anyway.
Yeah.
It is an incredibly overwhelming experience. Like it's very very hard to just process what the hell is actually happening in this game. This is the thing, like it was almost impossible to follow a lot of like the actual moment to moment events in it, but I was still able to complete it and I still roughly understand what was going on. It's just all those little things like, which one of you guys is Smokey? What's the point of the bar? Why does that kid need a doll? Who's the guy in the sand? Like it's just, those are the questions I
Yeah.
don't quite understand, but I still sort of was able
Hmm.
to follow the plot of it. You probably saw because you played the first 2 hours. There was a weird little guy who came out of the sand in like a hood.
Yeah. Yeah.
Yeah,
And you could summon him or something.
yes, right. You can summon him, and it says you can ask him to give you hints, right?
Hmm.
But it only works on the sand.
Hmm.
There is no more sand after that area.
Yeah, I tried summoning him and he didn't show up, so now it makes sense.
There is nowhere else you can summon him. And if you go, I actually got lost at one point and went back to the sand and summoned him, and he didn't have anything to say to me. As far as I can tell, he shouldn't even be in this story. Like, he doesn't actually do anything. He just shows up one time and gives you an item that doesn't do anything.
So he lied on his resume.
He is apparently a character that's also in Kowloon's Gate.
Oh.
So he's like a cameo from that. Maybe it's like a shared universe thing. I don't know. The hint thing is even weirder because, like, there are ways to get hints in this game from robot dogs.
Oh, the save points.
Yeah, so there are these save point robot dogs. They look exactly like K9 from Doctor Who, to the point where the developers should probably be thankful the game was never that successful because they absolutely could have been sued over this. It is exactly the same design. Some of them are save points, but some of them give you hints. They look the same. You don't know which is which. This is a game like it's like this. Why is it like this? Like this. There's this other example of there is a like a medium lady called Agatha, and her
Mhm.
deal is you can give her items and she actually does like Dark Souls item description text for them. Like she'll do this like reading of them and tell you a little bit about what they mean, but like that never really did anything. Like it gave you a little bit of background on NPCs that I'm just sort of like I don't even know if this character mattered at the end of the day. Also, like, I know that quite a bit of plot crucial information is locked behind which of Leica's personas you're controlling. But because the game is structured the way it is, like, once an event is over, it's over. If you play through an event as, like, Yolanda, there might actually be really important information that you only know if you play through it as Spacer, but the event's over now. So I think actually, in order to do a 100% playthrough of Planet Laika, you would need to beat it 3 times. This is the thing. Despite all of that, despite all of these just like random things being thrown at you and explained once and then referenced again 3 hours later with no context, I hope you were paying attention. It is still hanging together, like thematically,
Okay.
because it's kind of all tying back into this idea of like people trying to separate like good and bad from themselves, trying to sort of grapple with like all these terrible things that have happened and either accept them or suppress them. The people who made it, the word that they come back to over and over is Puritanism.
Okay.
And they say they were specifically inspired by like American kind of Bible thumping theology. This belief that
Okay.
like there's absolute good and absolute evil. And they were saying that like that interested them as Japanese developers because they were used to thinking of evil in a different way. They said to them evil meant something that kind of went against social norms. It didn't mean a substance. And the game is kind of about them like unpacking that relationship. So like the whole deal with Laika's power is that Laika is hypersensitive to the evil around him to the point where he's able to touch it and it just gets inside of him and it like collects in him until it makes changes to him. Like the three persona that Laika has, like they are all born out of terrible events, but it's not as simple as like Laika's trying to get back at his dad. So like Ernest the strong guy, like Laika creates that because Laika wants to believe that Laika could protect his baby sister, who is subsequently never born. And like Yolanda is created because Laika wants his mother to have a friend and someone to talk to, and she is created at the moment that Laika's mother dies. And like the longer it goes on, the more you discover that like actually Laika and his mother, like they were abused, but they were not passive the whole time. Laika was feeding his stepfather alcohol that he knew was tainted to try to get him to die faster. Laika and his mother conspired to frame his stepbrother for a fire that killed his stepfather's horse. And then like you've got like this Galil character whose whole approach is like trying to purge all the evil from him and become what he sees as like a pure good person. But then there's other characters trying to deal with the problem of like evil around them by like there is someone who seals themselves in a bottle and people actually sort of celebrate that and like look, he became a purely good person because now nothing can touch him.
It's like that movie about the boy in the bubble.
Yeah, and like the whole concept of like the evil mind is like the Martians tried to purge everything bad about themselves. And it becomes about the characters having to sort of live with like all this negativity around them rather than try to like force it out of themselves. I'm sort of lost for words even attempting to describe a lot of Planet Laika. Like it's not fun. That's the important thing to say. Like it's I'm not going to pretend that like huge chunks of this weren't really fucking annoying.
Mm-hmm.
Like I was like quite exasperated by the end. Not in the way that I think they were expecting. Like I was not emotionally drained by it as much as like I was getting kind of irritated at the amount of back and forth meandering I was doing in this honestly fairly small space to just try to find the next person to talk to. It weirdly feels like a walking simulator.
Yeah.
Maybe that's a way of describing it. It's like an unsettling walking sim about childhood abuse.
Oh, yeah.
It's full of mechanics that are explained in detail and then used once. There's lots and lots of just like searching every building in a very tedious navigate city to try to find a character to make the plot move forward, but they might not make the plot move forward. A lot of crucial information can very easily be missed, but I'm not sure I would play through this again to get it. What I can say is like there is absolutely nothing I have ever played that is even remotely like Planet Laika. And the people who made it like are legitimately trying to explore shit that feels pretty well ahead of its time.
Yeah.
So even though like I think a lot of this sort of doesn't quite work, it's worth looking into anyway.
Well, Thank you, Sophie.
Thank you, Sin.
Thank you, Planet Laika. Thank you, Mars.
It's not even. Yeah, it's Mars. It's not. Well, okay. Planet Laika is the planet Laika because that's actually like kind of one of the implications that maybe none of this happened and it was all in Laika's head. No, I'm not. I'm not joking.
Yeah.
And like the fucking ending looks like End of Evangelion.
Thank you, Evangelion.
Where like everyone's like consciousness is separated from their bodies and they fly off into the sky, and then I think you're in like a dollhouse or a snow globe or something.
Okay. And thank you everyone for listening.
See you all next time.
Bye.
Bye.